Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So, in the last two sessions, we have attempted to fill in some of that history from 70 CE up through 135. Because again, we tend to have some gaps. Now, one of the other things that I've noticed, and unfortunately we can't cover the other 1600 years of history, but one of the other things that I think tends to come out is when people begin to talk about the Holocaust and talk about the state of Israel, one of the big struggles is actually understanding where these events came from historically. What's the origins of the Holocaust? And we're not going to get into a ton of that, but we will look at a little bit of it. Really, we would need a whole series for it. But we're going to back up to the 1800s and a little bit of the 1700s. And in doing so, that's going to help us, I think, understand what was going on with the Jews at the time and better see perhaps what God was doing there. So hopefully this is going to create a context for us to understand in the next few days as we get to the Holocaust and then the creation of the State of Israel. So today we're going to be looking a lot at the 1800s. We have two main ideas here, and that is developing anti-Semitism. So we want to see how that gets created. And then we also want to see where Zionism comes from. Now, don't worry, I did say two, but we have three sections, so it's okay. Emancipation, that's going to be the first part that we're going to look at. So emancipation, we're going to actually look at the French Revolution, and we're going to take a look and quote the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which I thought was funny, since Brother John had that. I really wanted to sneak it into your PowerPoint, Brother Mark, because then I thought you could actually say, you know, I went to a Bible school and all three speakers in one day mentioned the Declaration of the Rights of Man. But I didn't do it fast enough. So we're going to go through emancipation, then we're going to talk about scientific racism. You'll notice I have it in quotes there. Don't get scared. I know that can sometimes seem as a touchy topic or whatnot. You don't need to worry about it because hopefully this will be something that helps explain what anti-Semitism is, right? That's the whole idea. This is not a diversity, equity, and inclusion class, so in case you're worried about that. The third part, we're going to look at the beginnings of Zionism. So where does that come from? Because really, what we're seeing here is the confluence of the emancipation of the Jews in the French Revolution, this scientific racism as it develops and grows into anti-Semitism, and all of these things come together at one point, which then creates Zionism. Right, so this is the way that this all opens up. What I want us to notice from this, the big thing for us to take from it, is that the modern age has led to major shifts in the Jewish community. What I mean by that is, yesterday we talked about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva creates this Kiddush Hashem, this idea of being a martyr for the name of God, and that is the way that holiness, right, that's what Kiddush means, that is the way that holiness to God is perceived within Judaism for centuries, up until this point where the scientific racism creates anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism leads to Zionism. And Zionism is a whole new way of looking at the world for Jews. Right? Zionism is the antithesis of Rabbi Akiva. So it's an important thing to note. Right? So this is the shift. This is the time when it changes. Now, not only is that a change in thinking for the Jewish community, but this was preceded by a few other changes in thinking. And so what we're going to note is that the Jewish community is really struggling to figure out, who are we? What do we represent in this world? Are we Jewish even? Right? So they're going to be struggling with this, and Zionism is going to be a response to that. The why question is, why did the concept of the Jewish race develop? Now, you might be thinking, what? What are you talking about? The concept of the Jewish race. Well, what we'll talk about as we go through in this class, and I want to just make this suggestion to you, is that unfortunately, and this is a very tragic result of the Holocaust and Hitler's propaganda, but the idea of a Jewish race really traces back to the Nazis. So that's an important thing to note, right? The Jewish race is a Nazi concept. And so what we're going to note is, why did it develop? Right? Because it actually starts before the Nazis, but where does it come from? And the Nazis are the ones who make it popular. So I'm going to actually suggest to you, Judaism is not really a race, it is actually a religion and a community. That's an important thing to note there. You can come and talk to me about that later if that kind of blows up your schema, or if that makes you mad. It's okay. We can talk about that, but that's my suggestion to you, right? Okay, so let's pick up the story in 1789. Now, we heard in class number 1, right, about all the bad things of the French Revolution, and that was good that we heard those things, right? In fact, it was good because of what I'm about to say. Now, I say that because I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not coming along and saying the French Revolution was wonderful. I'm coming along and saying, for a lot of Jews, that was the perception of the French Revolution, right? So this is a really big deal. So let's just back up and think a little bit about what life was like in Western Europe for Jews before the French Revolution. So let me just ask you this. Does anybody know where the first ghetto was established? Yeah? It was Venice. Yeah, wow, very nice. It was Venice. How about the year? No, actually, I don't know it either. I think it was 1451. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I actually just made that up. But I'm pretty sure it's 1400s. So that was the number that sounded right to me. So yes, the first ghetto was in Venice. So that's important for us to note because, number one, it's just interesting to recognize that a lot of what Hitler did was based on what the church did, right? There's tons of connections like that. The marking out Jews with a yellow badge, right? That also came from the church. There's all kinds of things along those lines, and I'll talk about more of that later. But what we want to see here is that life for Jews in Europe pre-French Revolution was not good, right? You had a ghetto, and there's different takes on what the ghetto was. Just to give you an idea on how bad things were. On one hand, people said, oh, well, there were ghettos to protect the Christians from the bad influence of the Jews, right? Well, here's actually how bad it was. A lot of Jews wanted to live in ghettos because it protected them from the Christians. Now, not that ghetto life was very good, right? But at least that way they had walls. So that was sort of how a lot of Jews felt about this at the time. So that hopefully gives you a sense of how terrible life was. Now, the reason that Christian mobs would often attack ghettos and attack Christians was because of something called the blood libel, which maybe you have heard of before. So the blood libel is this idea that Jews will take a Christian child, generally around Passover, and they will kill the child for their blood because they need it for rituals. There was very weird ideas about blood and whatnot. They said like they reenacted the crucifixion. There's different thoughts on it. Some said that the Jews had to drink it to replace the blood that they lost through menstruation. Who knows what that was about? But that was some of those very strange things, right? So there were all these weird rumors, like the blood libel. Another one that you had was a mistaken understanding of Michelangelo's Moses statue. Anybody seen that one? So Michelangelo's Moses statue, check it out. So if you look at Michelangelo's Moses statue, you will notice that his statue has horns. Moses has horns in Michelangelo's Moses statue. Now, that actually was not anti-Semitic, in case you're wondering. It was a misunderstanding of Jerome when he was translating the Latin Vulgate. So the Hebrew in Exodus 34, Moses comes down from the mountain, and his face is shining, right? His face is shining. Well, the Hebrew literally says he has horns of light coming from his face. Now, what it means by that, horns of light, is like beams of light, you know? It was like, sort of thing. Okay, so he had beams of light coming from his face. Jerome misreads it, right? So Jerome puts into the Latin that Moses had horns. So Michelangelo is like, oh, okay, horns. So he makes a statue with Moses having horns. And you can check it out, you know, just look up Michelangelo Moses statue, right? And you can see his horns right there. So what this creates is it reinforces a traditional trope against the Jews. And the trope was actually based on a misreading of John chapter 8. You are of your father the devil, right? The trope was that Jews were demons. So Michelangelo's statue comes out and everybody's like, we knew it! Jews have horns. And in fact, this is one of the things that's crazy to me. When I talk about this, I will inevitably have some of my Jewish students raise their hands. This is like every class when I talk about this. And they will say, I have had Christians come to me and ask to feel my head to see if I have horns. Yeah, these are my students, in the U.S. So it's crazy to see that this is a thing still, right? This is a trope that has endured all the way for hundreds of years. Okay, so that was life in pre-French Revolution Europe, right? You had the ghettos. Jews were confined to certain professions, generally money lending. Right? That was one of the specific ones that they had to do. So that is why you have that stereotype of the Jewish moneylender. It's because the Christians actually forced them to do that. So that was life. Now, what's amazing then about the Declaration of the Rights of Man is that it changes all of that for Jews. So I want to just quote to you from Johann Gottfried von Herder. You might figure out from his name that he's not actually connected to the French Revolution. He's very German. But he was a German philosopher who was writing the same year as the French Revolution, 1789. And what we're going to see, we're going to trace through some of the history of France and Germany. We're going to see how they sort of come to this in parallel, although Germany's a little later than France. But what von Herder is talking about here is he's going to make this prediction. And his prediction is, right now, we see the Jews as parasites. But he says, with all the changes that are happening in Europe, someday we won't. So that's his prediction. So just listen to this. Saying something like this in 1789, this was crazy, right? Nobody saw Jews like this. But this is just an example of how the world was starting to change at the time. So here's what he says in paragraph 1. The Jews we shall consider here only as parasitical plants, having fixed themselves on almost all the nations of Europe and sucked more or less of their juices. After the downfall of Rome, there were yet comparatively few of them in Europe, but from the persecution of the Arabs they fled thither in great multitudes and divided themselves nationally. A time will come, however, when no person in Europe will inquire whether a man be a Jew or a Christian, as the Jews will equally live according to European laws and contribute to the welfare of the state. Listen to this sentence. Nothing but a barbarous constitution could have been such an obstacle as to have prevented this or rendered their abilities injurious. So here's what he's saying. He's saying, this is how we thought of them before. But today is a new age. This is a new time. When someday, nobody's going to care if somebody's Jewish or Christian. He says it's not going to matter. It's not going to make any impact. The only thing that could stand in the way is a barbarous constitution. Meaning, right, an uncivilized government. So this is the change in thinking. That you used to have Jews confined to a ghetto. They had a specific profession that they had to have. You had all these rumors about their horns, about them drinking blood, killing Christian kids, all of this, and he says that's all going away. And in fact, he's right. Right? He's watching what's going on in France, and he's totally right about how that's working. Now, the French Revolution, it's very bloody, right? But it ends up, 1789, you get the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which states, Article number 1, all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions cannot be found but on common utility. No person shall be molested for his opinions. This is Article 10. Even such as are religious, provided that the manifestation of these opinions does not disturb the public order established by the law. This is exactly what von Herder was saying. The time will come when no one will care if you're a Christian or a Jew. Right? And so there it is in Article 10. You will not suffer any kind of persecution for your religion. So Declaration of the Rights of Man becomes a really big deal for French Jews, because this is the first time since the Roman Empire that Jews had had the possibility of citizenship. That's crazy, right? It's been a millennia since Jews had had citizenship in a country. However, there's still a little bit of anti-Judaism going on. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man says, if you're a human, right, there it is, all men, and by men, they didn't just mean men, they mean humans, right? All humans are born and remain free. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man explains, if you're a human, then you are a citizen. Then you can be a French citizen. Now, this just shows you the depth of the anti-Judaism here, because they actually have to have, the National Assembly has to have a specific debate relative to, do Jews qualify as humans? Does the Declaration of the Rights of Man apply to them? So here's part of the debate. Here's one side of it. I'm not going to tell you his name because I have no idea how to pronounce French. Sorry. And I can't pretend in Canada. You guys will know I'm a fake. The Jews must be assumed to be citizens as long as it is not proven that they are not citizens. Right? So what he's saying is, Jews are citizens unless you can prove they're not humans. Right? That's his whole thing here. As long as they do not refuse to be citizens. So if you can prove they're not humans, then they're not citizens, or if you can say that they don't want it. Right, so those are the two qualifications. So he puts out, we got to give them citizenship. You know, we've created this new republic. We can't just come out and say, these are our principles, and, oh, actually, we don't abide by them. Right? He says that's not a thing that we can do. We have to give them citizenship. This guy, on the other hand, is very worried about it. So here's the other side of the debate. He says, a decree that would give the Jews the rights of citizenship could spark an enormous fire. Once they obtained a similar favor from the Parliament of England, but immediately the bakers refused them bread, and these unfortunate Jews very soon demanded the repeal of the bill. Now that's very hard to believe, just as an aside. Number one, I'm not aware of any time that England gave citizenship to the Jews until 1890. And then in addition to that, having bakers refuse to give you bread is a lot better than having to live in a ghetto and be a moneylender and have everybody think you have horns. So you know, I don't know about this. He then says, though, I propose to establish a committee which will be charged with the revision of all the legislation concerning the Jews. So he says, you know what? He has the typical delay strategy, right? You know what that is? Let's have a committee talk about it. So he says, send it to the committee. And guess what? National Assembly says, yeah, good idea. Let's send it to the committee. So they send it to a committee. Now, remember, what year is this? 1789, right? 1789. Here we go. Note the year. 1791. The committee debates for 2 years on whether Jews are humans. Okay. 2 years later, they publish this. Paragraph 1. The National Assembly, considering that the conditions requisite to be a French citizen and to become an active citizen are fixed by the Constitution, and that every man who, being duly qualified, takes the civic oath and engages to fulfill all the duties prescribed by the Constitution, has a right to all the advantages it ensures. In other words, right, every man, this paragraph 1 says, we finally determined Jews are humans. Paragraph 2. It then annuls all adjournments, restrictions, and exceptions contained in the preceding decrees affecting individuals of the Jewish persuasion, who shall take the civic oath, which shall be considered a renunciation of all privileges in their favor. So it says, number 1, Jews qualify. The Constitution actually applies to them. Paragraph 2, all the other decrees that we made against them in the last 2 years, we now repeal. Because in that 2-year period, Jews weren't citizens. So they could have anything done to them. So finally, 1791, this is the first time in over a millennia that a European nation has given citizenship to the Jews. This is the reaction as time goes on. This is one of the head of the Jewish community. This is actually in Prussia. So Prussia gives citizenship in 1850, following France. So it takes them about 60 years. In 1850, head of the Jewish community in Prussia says this. Now, I'm going to read this to you, and I want to just ask you, what's wrong with this quote? Oh, what a heavenly feeling to possess a fatherland. Oh, what a rapturous idea to call a spot, a place, a nook, one's own, upon this lovely earth. What's wrong with this?
It's not Israel.
Yeah, they had a place, right? They had had a place for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet, this is all of a sudden this opening to take full civic part in countries of Europe. And they say, wow, this is wonderful. The feeling of this. You know, we've never experienced anything along these lines. So what we're going to see here, and this is what's amazing about it to me, is God opens these doors here to citizenship, and on the other hand then, anti-Semitism develops. And so you have this push from both sides to, on one hand, get more involved in civic life, and on the other hand, recognize bad things are coming. And you've got to get somewhere where you can be freed from those bad things. And so Jews end up, as we'll see later, they end up with this choice of, what are you going to do? And ultimately, the place to go and the answer to this question is Zionism. But choosing Zionism is a very, very challenging choice, at least for those people who feel like this. So this is a chart. I don't know if you can read it, but it is a chart showing the dates when Jewish emancipation was done throughout Europe. So France is the first one in 1789. You have Prussia up here in 1850. Austria-Hungary is 1867. Britain does it in 1890. Rome is 1870. Russia is 1917, which is sort of interesting. 1917, that's the Communist Revolution. So France starts it, and the rest of Europe follows suit. Now, again, I just want to show you how integrated things became. Right, so as time passed, we had that idea of, oh, how rapturous it is to have a fatherland. And then, as the decades pass, the communities in Europe, the Jewish communities, particularly in Western Europe, start to feel much more at home with their citizenship. Right? You get one generation that was given that citizenship, and then the next generation comes up. And that's all they've known. They've known that we've been a full part of society. And so this is what they say. Whoever disputes my claim to the German fatherland. Now, just to tell you a little bit about this guy, Gabriel Reiser, both of his grandfathers were rabbis, right? So heavily integrated in Judaism. He says, whoever disputes my claim to the German fatherland disputes my right to my thoughts and feelings, to the language that I speak, to the air that I breathe. He deprives me of my very right to existence, and therefore I must defend myself against him as I would against a murderer. This is how he identifies. And so what you start to see is that a number of Jews, by the time you get to the 1920s, 1930s, if you were to go up to them and say, hey, who are you? You know, just a simple question like, who are you? The answer would be, I'm German, or I'm French, or I'm British. And this is why, in World War I, you had Jews fighting against other Jews on each side. He said at another point, forceful sounds of the German language, the poems of German writers have kindled in our breast the holy fire of freedom. We want to adhere to the German people. We shall adhere to it everywhere. And so he has this love, he talks about, of the German language. This is who we are. So those doors have been opened up, and now you have this identification with these European nations rather than with Judaism. Yes, I'm German, but, you know, I'm Jewish because that's where I go to synagogue, right? It's my religion, not necessarily my community. Now, just to give you a sense on how much things have been changing in Europe, Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of the UK, right? He was not Jewish, just to clarify. I don't know if you ever thought about that. Despite his last name, right? He was not Jewish. He was, in fact, Christian. So it's sort of a funny story. He did grow up in a Jewish family, but his father had an argument with the rabbi and decided that he was going to get back at the rabbi. So he took all of his kids and baptized them. So Benjamin Disraeli That's a really bad choice, right? But Benjamin Disraeli then says, okay, I'm not Jewish. He never identifies as Jewish and has no connection to that whatsoever. But I bring him up on here just to show everybody thought he was Jewish. I mean, how can you have that last name and people don't think you're Jewish, right? But everyone thought he was, and yet here he is getting to one of the highest points in the world, right, at the time. So this was a really big deal that he could become something like this. Paul Ehrlich, as well, he was a famed bacteriologist. Now, that was not a thing that Jews could have done before the 1800s. Right, so there's all these famous scientists. You have people later in the 1900s like Einstein, right? They all become highly integrated, and yet just a few years prior, that was impossible. Another example, that's Kaiser Wilhelm I. He was crowned in 1871, and the one who crowned him was Jewish, interestingly. Now, it wasn't just him, right? He led the delegation, but the delegation was led by a Jew, and so the Jewish community of Prussia felt like, wow, we've really arrived, right? Our community has taken part in the crowning of the emperor. And I mean, that's really kind of true. That's a big deal that they were involved in that. Okay, so that's on the one hand. Now, this chart is crazy, right? It blows my mind to think that people actually used this, right? Based off of how you looked, you could decide, you know, how close you were to a monkey. So that was sort of the idea there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. Now, I should explain scientific racism. The quote's there on scientific. I do not study science. I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian. So I do end up, because of that, studying pseudoscience. And so that's what this is, right? That's why the quotes are around scientific. So one of the really weird things that we're going to take a look at here is the history of the idea of races. Now, this is something that not a lot of people are aware of, and so I'm going to try and tread this carefully and explain it as best I can. If there's anything here that confuses you, it really doesn't bother me if you actually want to just shout it out and, you know, say, what about this? Or something like that. Right? I have people do that. You know, that's a thing in university. You argue with the professor. So it's totally fine if you want to do that, and we can sort that out, because I want to make sure that everybody feels like they understand and that this isn't weird. All right? So I want to quote to you first, before we get into that. I want to quote to you from someone that I won't tell you who they are until the next slide. The reason that I want you to read this quote is because we have to understand the background of where anti-Semitism comes from. And before we do that, we need to make a distinction. You maybe have noticed that I've been using the terms, two different terms, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. I don't know if you noticed that. Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Does anybody want to take a guess here at what the difference is? There is a difference. Anti-Judaism versus anti-Semitism. Okay. Anti-Judaism is being against Judaism as a religion, right? So for centuries, there were a lot of Christians who were anti-Jewish. So I'm putting this up so that you can see an example of anti-Judaism. Anti-Semitism does not exist until the 1800s. The reason for that is because anti-Semitism is against Jews as a race, not a religion, against Jews as a race. And the reason that anti-Semitism does not exist until the 1800s is because the concept of Jews as a race did not exist until the 1800s. So nobody had that schema. Right? So anti-Semitism didn't exist. It was always anti-Judaism being against Judaism. Now, that's a really, really important distinction. Because, think about this, this could mean life or death for a Jewish person. Because anti-Judaism means there's a way to escape it, right? And the way of escape is convert to Christianity. There is no way to escape anti-Semitism. It's impossible. Right? You can't be like, oh, well, I just changed my race. You know, like that's not a thing. It is impossible to change your race. And so what ends up happening is when anti-Semitism becomes a way that people start to think, all of a sudden, anybody who has ever had any connection to the Jewish community, right? Even a Jewish grandparent, and yet this person was like a priest or something, they become the target of anti-Semitism. And so this is why, if you've ever researched it, this is why thousands and thousands of Christians were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Because they had Jewish grandparents, or one Jewish grandparent, or something along those lines. Because that's anti-Semitism. It's racial hatred against Jews. So let me show you anti-Judaism so that you can see the distinction there. Now, again, I won't tell you who this is until we get to the next slide, because if you knew, it would shock you. Now, here it is. Ready? Now, whoever is inclined to house, feed, or honor such poisonous serpents and young devils, that is, Jews, who are the worst enemies of Christ our Lord and of us all, also desires to be mistreated, robbed, plundered, disgraced, spat upon, and cursed by them, and to suffer every evil. To such a man I faithfully commend these Jews, and if this is not enough, let him climb into their mouths or crawl up there, I edited that, and worship such holy shrines. That's pretty outrageous, right? Let him boast that he was being merciful while strengthening the devil and his young devils in their blaspheming of our dear Lord and of the precious blood with which we Christians are redeemed. He thinks himself a perfect Christian. Right? This is the person that's helping Jewish people. Right? He thinks himself a perfect Christian, full of works of mercy, but on Judgment Day, Christ will reward him along with the Jews in the eternal fires of hell. Thus, for we Christians, this matter should and must not be seen as trifling. Rather, it is extremely important that we seek contrary advice and so save our souls from the Jews, that is, from the devil and eternal death. Martin Luther, 1543. Now, it's weird to see, by the way, if you've ever studied Luther, his thoughts changed throughout his life. So he actually wrote a book. One of his first books about Judaism was called On Jesus as a Jew. And he has this idea that if we recognize that Jesus was Jewish, we recognize the hope of Israel connection to Jews, he says, oh, well then Jews will all want to become Christians. So he goes around and he tries to be nice, and it doesn't work, so he writes this. He was a man of extremes, right? So he does that, right? Weirdly enough, in this book, the book is called, if you're interested ever in reading it, it's called On the Jews and Their Lies. One of the strangest things about it, On the Jews and Their Lies, is that he lays out a plan for how the Jews should be dealt with in Germany. And that plan is, number one, arrest them all. Number two, put them into forced labor. Number three, take their books, their Torah, their Talmud, and burn them. And number four, burn all their synagogues. Now, that might remind you of something that happened in Germany. That starts the first government-sanctioned attack on German Jews is November 9th and 10th, 1938. It's Kristallnacht. That day, all of those steps that Luther laid out are put into action. Just so happened to be Luther's birthday. And Hitler writes in Mein Kampf how more people need to learn to be like Martin Luther. Very strange. Coincidence? It's hard to believe. So, that's anti-Judaism, right? And the problem is that you can see Hitler with his anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism plays right into anti-Semitism. And so that's why Hitler was able to take a nation that 95% of the people identified as Christians, and he was able to take them and bring about something like the Holocaust, right? So that's anti-Judaism. Now, anti-Judaism in itself sort of was able to keep the murder at bay, because it always said, our focus is on conversion. The problem is when racism started to become a science. So I want to read you this quote because it really paves the way for what we're going to look at. This is a book called Racism in Europe. It says, races may not exist, but there has been and continues to be a widespread belief in such categorization, and this belief in turn has had enormous implications for the way in which white Europeans have historically set out to dominate, exploit, and kill inferior peoples. Now, don't get worried. It won't get worse than this. Now, let me just explain to you what this is saying, right? The idea here, when in saying races may not exist, here's what this person means. There is a distinction between a race and an ethnicity. And a lot of times those two things get used as synonyms. Race and ethnicity. And also culture kind of gets thrown in there too. The distinction is really important, right? And you can look this up in any dictionary, and this will bear out what I'm saying. A race is not just how someone looks or where they're from, but a race always, without fail, has characteristics attached to it. In other words, this person looks like this, therefore they act like this, or they think this way. Right? This is why, if you see those pictures of the Holocaust, you will notice the Nazis went around and measured people's noses. Right? And we look at that and we're like, that's outrageous. Like, you see them measuring people's faces, but because they believed in racial science. And racial science meant if you look a certain way, you will act a certain way. So that's why this says races don't exist, right? You decide how you act. Your own decision. Sometimes culture, right, will dictate that. And so you can say, oh, a culture acts like this, because in general, certain cultures do different things. But when this says races may not exist, what it means is this categorization of you look like this, therefore you will act like that. That's not really a thing. And yet, the bad part is that the term race, we use it now as just a synonym with ethnicity, and yet, because we don't define it when we're using it, some people understand it like just meaning ethnicity, and other people understand it as meaning it as all these characteristics of how you're going to act. So that's part of the difficulty. Now let me just show you how this develops and why this matters for anti-Semitism, all right? So races, the idea of races, historically develops. It starts in the 1600s. It starts in the 1600s because Europeans start exploring. They go to Africa and they see people who look very different than them, right? And they're trying to figure out, whoa, you know, this is weird. And the people in Africa are trying to figure out who are these white people, right? Like everyone's trying to put this together. And so they're trying to make sense of the world. So a lot of European scientists are thinking, wow, you know, we had no idea that there were these people who looked different. So what do we do with this? Now, just to show you, so kind of pause with them, with those scientists, just to show you that there was no concept of race in the 1600s yet. Right? Races, the idea, had not yet been invented. This is the General Assembly of Virginia in 1667. Slaves first came to the colony of Virginia in 1620. So there had been slavery here for almost 50 years. Now, notice the basis of slavery. Listen to this. It says, an act declaring that the baptism of slaves doth not exempt them from bondage. What's the basis of slavery? Religion. Do you notice that? It's not actually the color of your skin. That's why they have to have this act. Because everything's going crazy here in Virginia in 1667. The reason is because in their minds, it wasn't actually about a race because they didn't know races. Instead, they said, well, if you're a Christian, you can't be a slave. So, what do you do when someone's slave's kid decides to get baptized? Right? That's what this whole law is about. What do? They're baptized, so they're a Christian, so therefore, technically, they shouldn't be a slave, but their parent was a slave. So, what's going to happen? Now, it would be very easy to solve this by just saying, if you're black, you're a slave, right? They don't do that because they don't have that schema, right? The idea of a black race is not a thing in 1667. And so they write this whole thing trying to explain, well, they do get baptized, but, you know, they're not really Christians, so they don't actually count. And that's what this whole law is about. Here's how the whole concept of race actually develops. So this is Carolus Linnaeus. You've perhaps heard of Linnaeus with all of his classifications genus, species, all that sort of thing. He writes his book here, Systema Natura, in 1740. And he is one of those scientists who's trying to figure out, what do we do with the differences in people? So he comes up with 4 categories of people. He says they are Europaeus albus, which means white European, Americanus rubensens, Asiaticus suscus, and Africanus niger, which is black African, right? So these are kind of the 2 main ones, Europaeus albus and Africanus niger. Now there's no issue with doing that, right? He's categorizing people because it's helpful in terms of figuring out, okay, here's where these people live, here's what they look like, that sort of thing. There's no problem with that. That's not racist, there's no issue. What happens though is, how it works in the publishing world, right? You publish another edition because you want to sell more copies, you publish another edition, and you got to add a little bit of extra stuff in the next one. Well, by the time we get to the 10th edition, all of a sudden, Linnaeus has added things. Linnaeus is one of the primary people who has created this idea of races. Here's what he did. Now see if you notice what happened here. Right? Before he just listed, these are the 4 categories. Now look at this. This is Africanus niger, right? So black African. Here's his definition. It's in Latin, so I'll give it to you down here in the English. He says, black, phlegmatic, meaning unemotional, and lazy. Dark hair with many twisting braids, silky skin, flat nose, swollen lips. Sly, sluggish, neglectful, anoints himself with fat, governed by choice. Now, do you notice what happened here? He took the way that they looked and interspersed it with observations he made about how they acted, right? And so all of a sudden, you pick up Systema Natura, and you're like, oh, okay, I understand. Black people are all lazy, right? That's what he says. Not only that, they also don't have any emotions. And this actually became one of the big reasons that they were enslaved for so long. Because enslavers said, they have no emotions, we can't hurt them, right? Sure, split apart families, all that kind of thing. It doesn't matter. Because we know that according to this racial science, they have no emotions. So that's the issue, right? So this is a race, which is different than an ethnicity. An ethnicity is where you're from, it has to do with what you look like. But a race also attributes characteristics to who you are. Okay, we're going to skip Robert Knox because he's crazy. The other guys are crazy, but he takes it to a whole nother level. Okay, so this then happens as well to Jews. So this racial science becomes a thing. People start thinking about black people in this way, and they get this idea that the way you look determines how you act. And we would say, oh, we don't believe that today, right? But it's one of those things that in using some of the language, sometimes it confuses people, and that's part of the challenge, right? Now, here's the thing. People then started to say, okay, well, that's interesting. If the way you look affects how you act, well, then what about Jews? Right? They have the same skin color as us for the most part, but there's certain characteristics. And even Jews will say things about looking Jewish, right? That you have dark hair, that sort of thing. And so, well, race science made its way to that too. So in 1879, this guy here, Wilhelm Marr, coins the term anti-Semitism because he claims that Jews are a race called Semites. So he says a Semite is not just, people from Shem, it's specifically Jews. So by the way, if you've ever noticed when the term anti-Semitism is written out, sometimes it will be spelled with a hyphen. Have you ever seen that? Anti-Semitism with a capital S, and then anti-Semitism, all one word. Anti-Semitism comes from this guy because he believed that Semites were a race, right? So you were anti-Semites. The typical way now to spell it is without the hyphen because you're not acknowledging that Semites are a thing, right? So it's just anti-Semitism, one word, meaning hatred of Jews. Anyway, not that that's hugely significant, but it's one of those interesting things to be aware of. So this is what he says, and again, note the racism in this, right? Racism meaning that he attributes characteristics to them outside of just looks or whatever, right? Here's what he says. Why are we surprised? We have among us a flexible, tenacious, intelligent foreign tribe that knows how to bring abstract reality into play in many different ways. Not individual Jews, but the Jewish spirit and Jewish consciousness have overpowered the world. Right? So he's attributing all these ideas. He says, if you're a Jew, you're flexible, tenacious, intelligent. Now, it's true that Jewish culture puts a big emphasis on education, right? So people get this idea that, oh, all Jews are smart or something like that. It doesn't mean that if you're born into a Jewish family, that all of a sudden you're going to be a genius, right? Like, there's a difference here. On one hand, if you say all Jews are smart, right, that actually leans towards this idea of anti-Semitism because you're painting all Jews with a characteristic. Whereas saying Jewish culture emphasizes education and places a big importance on that. And so a lot of Jews go on to higher education, they get advanced degrees, that sort of thing. There's no issue in that. That's just true, right? That's just a thing. So it's sort of an important distinction to make. And I bring that up because, again, when we don't make those distinctions, some of the things that we say end up hearkening back to this, right? And that's not what we want. So this is the birth of anti-Semitism. Now, I see that I have just a few minutes left. So let's talk about the two paths. On one hand, the French Revolution opens up citizenship to Jews, and they find that they're being incredibly integrated into society. In fact, they're taking these jobs, they're becoming successful, like the Rothschild family, right? They become incredibly successful. So they're wealthy, they're doing good, they're now in education, they're getting the advanced degrees, all of that sort of thing, and they're enjoying their position within society. On the other hand, anti-Semitism is now developing and is starting to notice things like their success, right? And the success of the Jewish community feeds into that anti-Semitism, and it becomes worse and worse and worse. And so the Jewish community has a decision to make. Are they going to say, well, we'll just continue to integrate into society, see if we can keep doing better? Or will they say, we got to get out of here? Now, what ends up happening is different groups go different ways. So you have this here. This is the Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, which is the Central German Citizen of Jewish Persuasion Committee. So that's, I don't, they needed a better name. But that's what they did. They created this as an assimilation organization for Jews. Right? So they decided, well, the big issue here, the reason that anti-Semitism exists is not because we need to head towards Palestine, but it's because we haven't become German enough. So they put this together, and they start saying, how do we become more German? This is where Reform Judaism comes from. If you've ever heard of Reform Judaism comes out of German Judaism in the 1800s in an attempt to say, what are our customs that we can get rid of? Right? What are the customs that are not necessary in order to make us more like the Germans around us? Right? So that's where they go on that end. And so one of them says this, right? This is how he identifies. Throughout my life, I have felt above all and very simply French. I've been tied to my fatherland by long family tradition, nourished by its spiritual heritage and its history. I've loved it very much and served it with all my strength. Now, on the other hand, other groups of Jews realize that it's not going to get better if they assimilate. They note that the Ottoman Empire is starting to take this position of the sick man of Europe, and they note that opportunities could perhaps open up for immigration to Palestine. Now, this had always been a hope within the Jewish community. This is what they say at Passover. Maybe you might recognize it. It's the Shana Haba'ah by Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Right? So this is what they would This is what they would say at Passover. So they'd always kind of had that idea, right, that we will be back in Jerusalem. And so some of them recognized it's time. It's time to do this. So let me wrap that up. Let's see. The challenge is that Jerusalem looks like this. And so you have this group of people who on one hand are assimilating. They're doing so much better as those who are assimilated, right? They're able to avoid some of the persecution because they're assimilating. They're able to get more into society, create more wealth. German Jewry, the German Jewish community, was the wealthiest Jewish community in Europe, right? Because they just integrated. And on the other hand, you have this, right? This is trash in a street of Jerusalem. Like you don't want to go to a place like that, right? Like that looked gross. This was the population that you'd be moving to. 85% at the time were Muslims, 11% were Christians, 4% were Jews. Now, just to give you an idea on who the Jews were that were there, they were referred to as the Yeshuv. Now, Yeshuv means inhabitants, right? So they were just called the inhabitants of Palestine. This was kind of the stuff that they did. They were very religious, and they felt like Rabbi Akiva. So what they did is they lived in the land waiting for something to happen. They lived on welfare from the Jews of Europe. So the Jews of Europe made large amounts of money being integrated into society. They sent it down to the Yeshuv, and the Yeshuv lived off of that. They did not work. They spent all their time in prayer. So we get this idea of, sometimes we think about like, oh, Israel, Palestine, and we see the orange groves and all that kind of thing, and we think, wow, they were working. The kibbutzim, like they were working the land and all this. They weren't in the 1800s, right? That's the Zionists. The Zionists change everything. In the 1800s, what you had was the old Yeshuv that lived in squalor and that had nothing because all they had was what they got from the Jews of Europe. This is a man who went and traveled through there in the 1800s. He talks about this. He says, those Jews that are old, who have a little money, travel to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, and still hope that they will someday all come together from all countries into their own native land and there secure hold of the government. The well-to-do Jews send money to Jerusalem to support them, for one cannot make any money there, nor is there any money there. So that was the situation. Now that was the 1500s. So this whole idea, that's not till the Zionists come in. This is the diary of Thomas Jones, who went to Jerusalem in 1888. This is how he saw it. He says, this part of the city, the Jewish quarter, which is the cleanest part now, right? The Jewish quarter is very dirty and is occupied by the Jews and West African people. Jerusalem is a very dirty city, all being built upon hills, and it has no drainage. Ew, right? Think about that. As the streets are narrow and are receptacles for all kinds of refuse, you can form some idea of their filthy condition. So, here's the situation. In the 1800s, you have Jewish communities saying, look, we're integrating. Look at the wealth we've accumulated. Look at the education we've been able to give our children. And on the other hand, you have people saying, yes, but look at anti-Semitism. It's coming. And that's the Zionists. But all of them, Zionists and those who are assimilating, are looking at Jerusalem saying, but who wants to go there? This place looks terrible, right? Like we've always said next year in Jerusalem, and we want to go, but like our houses are nice. Our lives are good. And so what we're going to see tomorrow is the push. The push that gets those Zionists to say, it's not next year in Jerusalem. It's right now. We have to leave now.